So if you're looking at the planning sheet number 2 and you're looking at the narrative prompt number 3 and you've already chosen a picture but you don't really know what to do, I would scroll down to the bottom and click on this exemplar. And an exemplar is an example of what your final product should look like in the end. So if I click on this, you're going to see that it's a copy of the story planning sheet and also the story of the narrative document where you want to write out your story. And what you'll notice is this is already pre-filled out. So I'll have a picture. These two documents is just an example. So I use the paper bag princess and I put that in there just so that you can see what the author's writing process might have looked like while he was planning out the story, but then also what the story will look like in this document and what parts are highlighted and what parts you have to highlight. So I'm not going to go over this worksheet. I'll go over a few parts just because I want to keep this video short. But if you scroll through it, you'll see that I filled out what the theme of that story is. I filled out who my characters were, so Elizabeth, Ronald, and Dragon. And I also put what they look like a little bit, but then also what their personality or character traits are going to be. And the reason why this part is important is because you need to characterize them later, and you need to show me why this character you're going to say is mean, or why this character is clever, or why this character is brave. So you don't really have to describe that in your personality trait, but you want to know it in your head so that when you write about them, you can show the audience how you want to portray them or how you want them to feel for the audience. The document is also going to ask you, once you finish this characterization part, what's the conflict of the story? So what is the problem that the story has? What does your protagonist want? How does the protagonist get in the way? How does your protagonist change throughout the story? So your conflict, in a way, helps the character develop and have some personal growth. So how is that going to happen in your story? If you plan this out, it'll be much easier to write it later, I promise you. And then finally, you're going to outline your story. So this was that plot diagram that we looked at last week. It's the same exact thing from last week. Let me quickly show you. Just written in a way that's a little bit easier for you to look at. So if you were to go back to last week, which you don't have to do, it's the same thing as these plot diagrams you worked on. You have the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then the resolution. So I've even included sentence sums on the side for you to look at it and know which part of the story you're going to be writing at. And this is basically just a quick brainstorm of what your story should look like. And it's not the final product at all. This is, if you really had to condense this, even shorter than a picture book would be. So that's an example of what the pre-planning sheet should look like. It is a lot of planning, but it will really help you generate a story in the end so that you're not stuck in any way. And then you have to write your story once you've done the pre-planning sheet. So this is the actual story from the picture book actually. I've just copied it and pasted it into here and then broken it up so that you can see what the exposition is in that story, where the rising action is, where the climax, the falling action, and the resolution is. So once you've written the story, you can actually erase these parts because they're kind of in the way. And in a real story, you don't have a part of the book that says exposition or rising action. I just put that there so that you can really see how the story has each part of a plot diagram. But again, once you finish that, you can completely take these parts away. And I can't do this because this is a PDF. But if it were to be a Word document, if I were to have it in a Word doc and it looks like this, once I finish my story, I can actually erase these parts out. Okay. That way, if you look back, it actually looks like a story. The reason why some of these things are highlighted is because I am highlighting characterization in blue, so how you are going to show that your character is mean or brave or clever. I'm highlighting dialogue in green, and so that's what are the characters saying to each other, what are the things in quotation marks, and I'm highlighting transition phrases that show me when I'm moving from one scene or one part of the story to the next part of the story. And this is what you have to do in your story too. And if you look through, you'll notice that I didn't highlight every single dialogue or quote, and I didn't highlight every single example of characterization. It only asks you 3 examples of characterization, 1 example of dialogue, and 3 transition phrases, just so that I know that you know what these parts of a story are. So for example, when is a transition? Finally is a transition. Elizabeth decided to. She's changing her action. That's another example of a transition. So those are my 3 examples. Dialogue, I can highlight any quote that I put in there. So any example of when a character speaks to another character or even speaks to themselves out loud. And then characterization, you're showing me parts of the story where you are basically proving that they are a certain way that you want them to be. So we say that, let's say Elizabeth is very sure of herself and confident, and let's say that Ronald is very rude, right? So what I highlighted is also actually a piece of dialogue, and dialogue is a tool that's often used to characterize characters. What they say tells you a lot about what they're like. So I highlighted, boy, you are a mess. You smell like ashes, your hair is tangled, and you are wearing a dirty old paper rag. Come back when you're dressed like a real princess. So I could have made that in green to show that it's dialogue, but I made it in blue because I felt like it really showed what the prince was like, what his personality is like. So that's my example of characterization, okay?